I'd like to begin our interview today by just talking a bit about your history in the industry. If you could please explain some significant events of the early part of your career, and how did that lead into your establishment of your first agency?
The first eventful chapter was that I had a client and was able to start my own business. I had worked for an engineering building company, one of the large engineer building companies during World War II. It would today have been the equivalent of a Bechtel or a Halliburton. And I had worked for the CEO, traveling with him while doing publicity for the company. Unfortunately, when I was in the service, he died, and I did not want to go back to that company as an employee. And I proposed to the management that I start my own business in New York and that they become my first client. And I was able to do what I look back on as a very respectable publicity job for a company that was in an industry that was really not one of the glamour industries. In fact, I was able to get them into Time magazine. I was able to get them into a Reader's Digest article. I was also able to get one of their projects, a large corn processing plant, into Life magazine. And so I think my early reputation was based on being a very effective publicist. And I still think that the publicity function is one of the most significant in our business. And unfortunately, I feel that people today in the field are not doing as good as aggressive a publicity job as we did 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Your first office, how many employees did you have in that office, and how did you separate the responsibilities for them?
My first office was a desk in my client up in the Graybar building. I had another client who was in a different type of engineering business, and he gave me desk space in his office and the use of a secretary and a telephone, and I started just in that small space for about a year. And it was about a year I then had my first office over on Broadway and 57th Street. And my first employee actually was my wife. I got married in October of 1947, and she had been a secretary, and so she quit her job and started working for me. And about the same time, I hired a young man who was going to Columbia University, whom I had met in the Army, and he was getting his college degree. He had been drafted before he finished college, and he worked for me as a part-time employee. He left me, later became the regional director of news for CBS and NBC on the West Coast. So we started with very modest beginnings. By 1952, I had 5 people, including myself, and we all kept fairly busy.
In those days, did you imagine what your company would become in later years?
I could never have imagined that. I thought that if we ever grew to be 20, 25 people, it would be a great success. You must remember that after World War II, there were literally dozens, probably a couple of hundred people here in New York who had started public relations firms after having been public information officers in the armed services. I was one of those. And some of them had already grown to have 10, 15, 20 people, and I was extremely envious of those and wondered if I would ever be able to achieve that kind of success and that kind of growth. The interesting thing is that of that number, there are only really a handful of people, firms, that have maintained and grown and prospered from those days. The first one was was Reuter and Finn, actually. Bill Reuter and David Finn started back in the very early 50s. I think Dan Edelman came second, started shortly after that. And then he was in Chicago, of course. I came along, started Burson Marstella. Actually, my own business started in '46. I met Bill Marstella in '52. We started Burson Marstella in '53. Golan Harris, which was then called Cooper Golan, I think, out in Chicago, started about that time also. And I think those were probably the only real survivors that made a great success. Of course, Fleischman started out in St. Louis about that time, too, maybe a little bit earlier than, I think they started during the war, or maybe even a little bit before World War II.
How did your experiences in World War II assist you when you did open your first office?
In a very unusual way. I went into the Army relatively late. I went in very early 1944. I could have stayed out of the war because I was working for a defense essential industry. I felt that I should go into the Army before the war ended. And I was put into an engineer combat group which went to Europe. We were in Normandy about 7 or 8 weeks after the invasion. And I learned very little that helped me directly in my business during the time that the war was going on. I suppose the greatest lesson I had was that I was living with people that different backgrounds, different socioeconomic structure than I had grown up in. Largely a bunch of people from Appalachia, and who were great soldiers and great people. And I learned a lot about people and how they reacted from them, because you live so closely with people when you're in the Army, and particularly when you're under fire. I got a great break after the war. I was able to get into the news staff of American Forces Network, which was the Army radio network in Europe. Arguably one of the greatest radio networks ever, because we were able to use all the programming of all the radio networks in the United States at that time. And so we had a great lineup of programs. And after the war, I was assigned to cover the Nuremberg trial. I was at the trial from the day it started on November 20th, 1945. I stayed until the end of March 1946. The trial continued through most of the summer. And in fact, this is the 60th anniversary of the close of the trial. And just recently I was in this studio being photographed, being taped by BBC, which is doing a 3-hour documentary. But I covered the trial. I was in a courtroom day after day after day. And when I got back, one of the things that people wanted to talk to me about was the Nuremberg trial, and so I had a lot of entree that I possibly would not have had if I had not been at Nuremberg. And that's probably what I got most out of the Army that had effect on my business.